You've probably noticed it for years now. The way you can walk into a room and feel the temperature of other people's emotions before anyone speaks. You sense when someone's lying, even if their words sound perfect. You catch the tremor beneath a smile, the tightening jaw behind polite laughter. It's not that you want to know, you just do. Carl Jung once warned about people like you. He said the greatest danger to the human psyche isn't madness or trauma. It's consciousness that grows too sharp, too sensitive, too awake. Because the moment you start seeing what others refuse to see, you stop belonging to the world they live in. Jung called this rare state differentiated perception, a mind so attuned that it reads the hidden architecture of reality. But awareness, he said, comes with a cost. The brighter the light of consciousness, the darker the shadows it exposes. He learned this not from theory, but from a single patient. A woman who arrived at his clinic in 1913, the same year Jung himself began his descent into the depths of his own psyche. She was quiet, self-contained, and introverted, intuitive in Jung's typology, yet her perception cut through the surface of things like a blade. She could enter a house and know who was pretending to be happy, who was secretly breaking apart, who carried hatred they didn't even know they carried. Jung wrote in his private notes, "The patient perceives the unconscious contents of others with uncanny accuracy, but this faculty brings her suffering rather than advantage." She couldn't engage in small talk. The falseness of it made her nauseous. Friends drifted away, sensing that she could see right through them. Employers let her go, saying her presence made others uncomfortable. And Jung realized something revolutionary. He wasn't treating pathology. He was witnessing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious for social survival. You probably know the feeling. The sense that your awareness isolates you, that the more clearly you see, the less you can connect. It's not arrogance. It's the fatigue of someone who hears frequencies others can't bear to notice. Jung warned that such perception turns you into a mirror society cannot look into. When people sense you see their hidden motives, they don't thank you. They resent you. You reveal the cracks in their masks, and they'll break the mirror before they face what it reflects. That is the first danger of seeing everything: projection. When others refuse to meet their own shadow, they hurl it at the person who can see it. You say, "You seem upset," and they snap, "You're always negative." You mention an obvious problem, and suddenly you become the problem. It's not logic, it's defense. Jung called this shadow projection, the instinct to attack whoever exposes what we can't admit in ourselves. You've lived this, haven't you? Being blamed for things you only noticed. Carrying tension that isn't yours. Feeling misunderstood not because you're unclear, but because you're too clear. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But most people don't want understanding. They want comfort. And when you disturb that comfort, you become the scapegoat, the vessel for the collective darkness everyone else is running from." He called this the problem of the superior function, when your greatest gift becomes your greatest curse. The ability to perceive patterns others can't see separates you from the unconscious herd, leaving you stranded on an island of awareness surrounded by oceans of denial. Over time, this isolation eats at your sanity. You start questioning whether you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too different. But Jung would tell you, you are not broken. You are simply tuned to a finer frequency of consciousness, and until you learn to manage that sensitivity, it will feel like pain. He observed that such people often suffer from what he called participation mystique, a blurring of psychological boundaries. Your empathy becomes so porous that you absorb the moods, desires, even physical aches of others. One moment you're fine, the next you're drowning in someone else's emotions. Their fear becomes your fear. Their sadness sits heavy in your chest. You mistake collective anxiety for personal weakness. This is the second danger of seeing everything: psychic contagion. Without boundaries, your perception turns from gift to infection. You become a sponge for the world's unconscious material. Jung saw this again and again in his patients. Individuals so open they lost track of where they ended and others began. He warned that if consciousness doesn't learn to differentiate, it collapses under the weight of what it perceives. He gave them a practice, one you can use now. Every day, spend time alone, truly alone. not scrolling, not consuming, not reacting. Let what you've absorbed from the world settle. Watch what thoughts remain when the noise fades. Those are yours. Everything else, return it to silence. He called this conscious discrimination, learning to tell the difference between what belongs to you and what you've unconsciously borrowed from everyone around you. That's the first step of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are without dissolving into the collective. But Jung also noticed something paradoxical. The reason you see darkness in others so easily is often because you haven't yet faced it in yourself. The shadow you expose is mirrored by the shadow you ignore. So he urged his patients to stop projecting and start integrating to meet the parts of themselves they feared. That's the second step, shadow integration. You must confront your own potential for deceit, envy, cruelty, not to justify it, but to claim it. Because everything you deny in yourself will reappear in someone else's face, and until you make peace with it inside, you'll keep fighting it outside. To see without judgment, you must first judge yourself and forgive. Only then does perception become clarity rather than condemnation. Jung illustrated this truth through history. He compared two men who saw too much, Friedrich Nietzsche and Meister Eckhart. Nietzsche's perception was brilliant, prophetic, but he identified with his insight instead of integrating it. He became the prophet of his own apocalypse, devoured by the very consciousness he unleashed. Jung saw in him the tragedy of inflation, when a human ego mistakes its vision for divine authority. Eckhart, the medieval mystic, saw just as deeply yet moved differently. He turned his perception into compassion. He used awareness not to destroy illusions but to heal them. He didn't fight the darkness. He illuminated it gently. That, Jung believed, was successful integration, the ability to hold vast perception without losing humanity. So where does that leave you? You, who sense too much, who know before others know, who sometimes wish you could unsee what you've seen. It means you stand at a threshold. You can either resist your perception and be consumed by it, or you can integrate it and become something extraordinary. Integration doesn't mean closing your eyes. It means opening them with wisdom. It's learning to carry the fire of awareness without burning yourself or others with it. And to do that, Jung insisted, you must keep building what he called psychological containers. A container is any practice, relationship, or creative act that lets you process unconscious material safely. Writing, painting, prayer, solitude in nature. Anything that helps the invisible become visible without overwhelming you. Because perception without containment leads to collapse, but perception with containment becomes transformation. You are not meant to shut off your sensitivity. You are meant to shape it. When Jung himself nearly broke under his own visions, he turned to creativity, drawing, painting, writing what would later become the Red Book. He said that art saved him, not because it dulled his perception, but because it gave it structure. Structure is how consciousness survives its own depth. So ask yourself, where does your awareness go when you have no one to share it with? Do you bury it, or do you build something from it? Because what you build will determine whether your perception destroys you or refines you. The truth Jung discovered is both terrifying and liberating. Some people are born with consciousness that outpaces collective readiness. They see too far ahead. And because the collective cannot yet understand them, it isolates them. But that isolation is not punishment, it's preparation. It's where perception learns humility, where insight turns into service. The world doesn't need you to see less. It needs you to see more wisely. And that wisdom begins the moment you realize your sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's an unfinished faculty, something that must mature through solitude, honesty, and love. You are not too much for this world. You are what this world will one day have to become. So breathe. Stop apologizing for the depth of your vision. Let it refine you instead of consume you. Because what you're carrying, the capacity to see into the unconscious of others, isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your evolution. And as Jung once wrote, the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective illusions that hold society together. Perhaps that's exactly what consciousness needs right now. Someone willing to see clearly anyway. Jung believed that the danger of extraordinary perception wasn't the vision itself, but the absence of integration. Seeing everything is not what destroys you. It's seeing without a center, perceiving without grounding, awakening without guidance. And yet, those who possess this kind of awareness rarely find teachers who understand them. How do you explain to someone that you can feel the atmosphere of a conversation before anyone speaks? That you sense deception like static in the air? That crowds exhaust you, not because of noise, but because of energy? For most people, that sounds like imagination, but for you, it's daily reality. Jung called individuals like you bridges between worlds. They stand between the unconscious and the conscious, translating symbols that others dismiss as coincidence. And the price of that position is loneliness, because to live between worlds means belonging fully to neither. He observed that there are 4 distinct ways people process this heightened perception. 4 forms that determine whether it becomes a gift or a burden. The first is the feeling intuitive. These individuals don't just understand others' emotions, they absorb them. They carry other people's heartbreak in their own chest. They confuse empathy with identity, compassion with self-erasure. You might be one of them if you often feel exhausted after helping others, not because you gave advice, but because you unknowingly carried their pain. Jung warned that these souls must learn emotional hygiene, not detachment, but sacred distance. Without it, they drown in the very empathy that makes them beautiful. The second type is the thinking intuitive, the pattern reader. They predict collapse before it happens, feel when a friendship is ending long before the final argument, see through illusions of success that everyone else still worships. To others, they appear cynical. In truth, they simply see the logical conclusions of what others deny. Jung noted that this type bears a heavy weight, the burden of foresight without control. They can warn, but rarely change the outcome, and this helpless clarity often hardens into bitterness unless transformed into service, the kind of wisdom that doesn't force but gently reveals. The third type, the sensation intuitive, perceives the unconscious through the body. They feel sickness before it manifests, tension before conflict, decay before endings. They sense that something is off, even when every appearance seems normal. Jung described them as early warning systems of the psyche, human seismographs registering the tremors of emotional earthquakes yet to come. But without awareness, this constant alertness mutates into anxiety. Their bodies carry messages that their minds can't decode. Healing for them begins with learning to interpret sensation not as threat, but as language. To ask, what is my body trying to tell me about what's unspoken around me? And then there is the fourth type, the rarest, the pure intuitive. These individuals receive vast floods of information from the collective unconscious, but struggle to organize it. Their visions are accurate yet overwhelming, their insights profound yet chaotic. They often feel haunted by impressions they can't express, like radio antennas tuned to too many stations at once. For them, Jung recommended structure, art, ritual, philosophy, anything that helps shape the invisible into form. Because without a vessel, revelation becomes noise. You might recognize yourself in one or more of these patterns, and if you do, you also know the exhaustion that comes with them. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that follow anyone with advanced perception. The first is collective disruption. When you see through shared illusions, you destabilize the unspoken agreements that hold groups together. Families, organizations, even entire societies rely on convenient blindness to function. When you refuse to participate in that blindness, people will call you the problem. You're not. You're simply the one refusing to live inside the lie. But the collective cannot tolerate too much truth at once. So it pushes the truth teller to the margins, not because they're wrong, but because they're early. The second danger is psychological isolation. Jung called it the curse of consciousness. When you see what others can't, there's no one to share the view. You stand on a mountain of perception, but it's cold up there. You long to come down, yet you can't unsee what you've seen. He wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it." That loneliness, if misunderstood, can turn into despair. You start doubting your sanity just to feel human again. But the truth is simpler. The higher the awareness, the rarer the companionship. And the third danger, the most insidious, is identity dissolution. When your boundaries collapse under too much perception, you lose the sense of who you are. You feel everyone's emotions, but none of your own. You become the sum of the rooms you enter, the moods you absorb, the roles you perform. Jung called this psychological annihilation, the loss of self in favor of collective possession. It's not death of the body, but death of the center, and once the center dissolves, everything else follows. That is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, is not luxury, but survival. You must anchor awareness to identity, perception to purpose. Otherwise, the same light that wakes you will blind you. He outlined 3 stages for integrating heightened consciousness. Stage 1, recognition and differentiation. Recognize what is yours and what is not. You cannot evolve while carrying everyone else's unconscious. Jung instructed his patients to spend time in solitude daily, not as escape, but as purification. When silence feels uncomfortable, stay, because discomfort is where foreign energies rise to the surface to be released. Stage 2, shadow integration. The ability to perceive darkness in others requires courage to meet it in yourself. You can't help anyone confront what you still fear to see in your own reflection. When you stop denying your capacity for envy, deceit, manipulation, you become free of them. Awareness without ownership is moral arrogance. Awareness with ownership is wisdom. Stage 3, conscious participation. Once you know who you are and have met your own shadow, you can re-enter the collective without losing yourself. You become what Jung called a bridge between conscious and unconscious, someone who helps others see without imposing the sight. To do that, you must develop psychological containers, the ability to hold others' emotions temporarily without mistaking them for yours. This is how healers, artists, and mystics survive their own empathy. Jung observed that perception can either destroy or transform. The difference lies in integration. Without it, you implode. With it, you evolve. To illustrate this, Jung looked at his own descent into the unconscious between 1913 and 1919, years that nearly broke him. He wrote of being menaced by a psychosis, saved only by his capacity to understand what was happening through his work. His perception of unconscious material, both personal and collective, was so intense that he had to translate it into symbols, drawings, visions. That translation became the Red Book. It wasn't madness, it was metamorphosis. He realized that what looked like breakdown was actually the mind's attempt to expand beyond old limits of awareness. And through that, he concluded something radical, that people who see too much aren't damaged, they are early. Their perception is not a defect, but an evolutionary function. They carry pieces of consciousness humanity will need later. That's why Jung said the world depends on the individual who integrates, because evolution doesn't happen in crowds. It begins in one mind, then ripples outward. But even the most perceptive person cannot do this alone. He emphasized the need for what he called the few who understand. Not many, just a few. People who can meet you where you are, who don't flinch when you speak truths that others fear, who can stand in the light of your awareness without turning away. He described 3 kinds of allies every perceptive soul needs. The first are fellow individuated persons, those who have already made peace with their own depth. You recognize them instantly. No masks, no games, no performance, just presence. Conversations with them feel timeless because you're not explaining yourself, you're remembering together. The second group are those engaged in individuation, people actively doing inner work, therapy, reflection, spiritual practice. They might not perceive as deeply as you, but they understand the language of the psyche. They can hold space without collapsing into defensiveness. The third are natural containers, people who may not share your perception but possess emotional maturity. They've suffered enough to know how to listen. Their calm steadies you. They remind you that being sensitive doesn't mean being fragile. When you find any of these, Jung said, hold them close, because for consciousness to evolve, it must be witnessed. He wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but this cannot be realized in isolation. And yet, not everyone can handle your perception. So he advised a method he called gradual revelation, a protocol for sharing truth without triggering others' defense. Begin with small observations. Notice their response. Do they become curious or defensive? If they ask genuine questions, go deeper. If they shut down, stop. The goal isn't to convince, but to invite. Offer insight like light through a doorway, not like a searchlight in someone's eyes. Because what you carry is medicine, not ammunition. And medicine only works when the patient is ready to receive it. When used wisely, your perception becomes not a curse but a service. You become what Jung called a culture carrier, someone who helps humanity take the next step in consciousness simply by embodying it. The world doesn't evolve through arguments or revolutions. It evolves when enough individuals integrate what the collective still denies. You are one of those individuals. That is why your awareness feels heavy. It's carrying the weight of what the species hasn't yet learned to hold. The question is not whether you can see, it's whether you can see without losing compassion. Whether you can look at the unconscious, in others, in yourself, in the world, and still choose love over cynicism, clarity over judgment. Because the moment your insight loses empathy, it turns to arrogance. And the moment it loses humility, it becomes isolation. But when perception and humility walk together, they become wisdom. You are not cursed to see. You are called to understand. And the calling always comes with fire, the kind that purifies rather than destroys. In the silence between seeing and speaking, you'll learn what Jung eventually understood. That awareness, held with love, becomes light. And maybe that's what the world is waiting for. Not another prophet shouting truth into deafness, but quiet souls who can see everything and still choose to heal. There comes a point when you stop fighting what you are, when the effort to be ordinary collapses under its own weight. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop shrinking to fit rooms built for smaller souls. That's the beginning of real individuation, not a rebellion against society, but a reconciliation with your own nature. Jung called this the fourfold transformation of consciousness. It begins with recognition without overwhelm. The moment you accept that what you sense is real, you no longer gaslight yourself into believing you're overreacting or imagining things. You start to see your sensitivity as an organ of perception, not a malfunction. That's the birth of peace. Then comes integration without isolation, learning to stay connected to people without betraying your perception. Most highly perceptive individuals isolate because interaction feels heavy, dishonest, or draining. But Jung said individuation doesn't end in a cave. The point is not to leave the world, but to move through it with awareness, to be in society but not of its unconsciousness. You bring clarity into chaos, not distance from it. The third phase is service without sacrifice. It's when your perception stops being a wound and becomes an offering. You no longer need to save people. You simply see them, and that seeing itself becomes healing. You begin to understand what Jung meant when he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that self in service of the whole." You realize that the goal was never to escape humanity, but to redeem it through presence. And finally, there is legacy without attachment. When you use your perception to contribute to the collective evolution of consciousness, but without the need to be seen or praised. You work for the future, while knowing that truth often blooms long after the one who planted it is gone. You stop demanding understanding because you've learned that the awakened are rarely recognized in their own time. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites without tearing apart, to see both shadow and light and still stay whole. When you reach that point, you stop preaching and start embodying. Your life itself becomes a quiet transmission of awareness. But even then, there are traps, subtle ones that wait for every perceptive soul. Jung cataloged them meticulously. He called the first the inflation trap. It happens when you begin to identify with your insight, believing that seeing makes you superior. You start thinking you're meant to awaken everyone else. But the moment you believe you're chosen above others, you've fallen into the very unconsciousness you hope to transcend. Jung warned, the ego that identifies with the archetype becomes possessed by it. The cure for inflation is humility, to remember that perception is not ownership, it's stewardship. You're not the source of the light. You're the window it passes through. The second is the withdrawal trap. You see through the illusions of the world and begin to despise it. You retreat, telling yourself that others are too asleep to bother with. It feels like wisdom, but it's pride wearing a monk's robe. True consciousness doesn't escape the unconscious. It walks among it quietly, carrying a lantern. If you abandon humanity, you abandon the purpose of your own awakening. The third is the helper's trap, the compulsion to fix everyone as proof of your worth. You start defining yourself by the number of people you guide, heal, or advise, and slowly you vanish behind the role. Your identity dissolves not into the collective unconscious this time, but into the archetype of the savior. Jung saw this repeatedly. When perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. To serve consciously, you must remain a self. And the fourth trap is the return of overwhelm. Even those who integrate can regress during trauma or exhaustion. You stop guarding your boundaries and become flooded again by the collective. That's why Jung said integration is never permanent. It's a dance, not a destination. You keep tending the fire because even a small neglect invites darkness back in. To maintain balance, he prescribed a few disciplines, habits of consciousness rather than moral rules. Regular solitude, to sift what's yours from what's not. Selective engagement, to decide when and with whom to use your perception. Ongoing shadow work, to keep your vision clear of projection. Creative expression, to give form to what you feel before it crushes you. And most importantly, connection with others who understand, not many but a few. Because no one evolves in a vacuum. Even Jung, the man who mapped the unconscious, nearly lost himself until he found witnesses to his inner journey. He said the individual is always the bearer of the living spirit, meaning that transformation doesn't happen to humanity in bulk. It happens in individuals who dare to stay conscious in unconscious times. Those individuals are what he called consciousness pioneers, souls who sense tomorrow before the world is ready for it. Throughout history, they've always existed. The mystics, the poets, the scientists who dreamt ahead of their age. At first, they're ridiculed, then feared, then, decades later, quoted. They are the early nervous system of humanity, feeling the tension of evolution before it breaks the surface. That's you. That's why your sensitivity feels unbearable sometimes. You are detecting patterns that have not yet become obvious, carrying emotions the culture hasn't learned to name. Your pain isn't personal, it's prophetic. Jung wrote, "What appears first in the individual as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation." In other words, your internal work today is the blueprint for the world's healing tomorrow. When you integrate your perception, you make it easier for others to do the same. When you learn to hold light and darkness without breaking, you teach humanity what wholeness looks like. But the work is subtle. You're not here to convince or convert. You're here to embody, to live with such integrity that your presence itself becomes evidence of another way to be. This is how collective evolution happens, quietly, person by person, until the sum of the conscious outweighs the sleep of the many. And yet you must protect the vessel. A cracked container spills even the most sacred light. That's why self-care isn't selfish for people like you. It's structural maintenance for consciousness itself. You are carrying something fragile and immense, and the world will not handle it gently. So you must. Eventually there comes a day when your perception no longer feels like sight, but like understanding. You stop reacting and start recognizing. You no longer need to prove what you see. You let truth reveal itself through your calm. That calm is your crown. It's what Jung called the quiet triumph of consciousness. Remember the woman Jung met in 1913, the one who could feel every hidden motive, who saw so deeply that she couldn't bear to live among ordinary masks? After years of integration, her life changed completely. She learned to tell the difference between her emotions and those she absorbed. She became a counselor, guiding others through storms she once barely survived. She built friendships with people who valued her clarity instead of fearing it. Her perception didn't fade, it evolved. She no longer felt cursed by sight, she felt guided by it. Jung wrote that she learned not to see less, but to see more wisely. That is your task now. Not to dim your light, but to refine it. Not to close your eyes, but to open them fully with compassion. Because the danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with wisdom. If you can hold that wisdom, if you can balance the clarity of vision with the gentleness of heart, then your gift becomes what Jung called cultural medicine. The world is sick with denial. You are part of its cure. So the next time you feel alone in your awareness, remember, evolution always begins in solitude. You are not ahead of humanity by mistake. You are its experiment in what comes next. Stay patient with your sensitivity. Let it teach you. Let it guide you. Because one day when consciousness is ready, it will recognize you for what you've been all along, a pioneer of perception, carrying tomorrow's light in today's fragile hands.